Welcome. We're diving into an interesting presentation today from Boss Sill's Knowledge Bunker. Their theme, it's giving IT back.
Okay. Our mission today is to go through what this guide lays out.
Hmm.
We're going to unpack those core components of A.R.M templates, like how are they structured, what are the key parts that make them tick, what are those real-world benefits, because there are a lot of benefits.
Right.
And how can you actually use them effectively to manage your Azure infrastructure?
And there are a ton of benefits, so we're going to talk about that as well.
So are you ready to level up your Azure game a little bit?
Let's do it. I am. Let's level up.
All right. So jumping right into slide 1, introduction. The guide kind of kicks off by stating that A.R.M templates, they are JSON documents. And yeah, that's true, but it's almost more helpful to think of them like a blueprint.
Yeah.
A precise definition of everything you want in your Azure environment. This includes not just the resources themselves, like your virtual machines, your databases, but all the configurations and how those things relate to each other.
Uh-huh.
And, one of the big benefits that they emphasize in the guide is consistent and repeatable deployments.
Right. Yeah. Super important.
Imagine spinning up like identical environments for development, for testing, for production, and it's going to work every single time.
Yep.
That's the power of this stuff. It really reduces the risk of errors, those inconsistencies you might have.
Especially, again, going back to scale, like if you're deploying lots and lots of resources, for your company or for a client, however you're working with Azure, you want to make sure that all these things are exactly the same.
Exactly. You want that confidence.
Yeah, exactly.
And the guide also gives us a roadmap for where we're headed. We're going to look at how these templates are structured, those reusable functions they have, and those pre-built Azure Quick Start templates, which are super helpful.
Quick Start templates are awesome. We're going to get to those in just a bit.
Okay. So we have that high level. Let's get into the nuts and bolts.
Yeah. Let's break it down.
Slide 2. Understanding A.R.M template structure. They break down the fundamental structure into 3 parts. First, you have the schema. Now, the guide calls it, a pointer to a JSON schema file.
Right.
But think of it like a version number, like, when you get software, it's whatever.
Yeah.
It basically tells the Azure engine what version of the A.R.M template language your template is written in. And this is super important because it's got to know how to read your code, how to validate it, how to make sure it's going to work.
Yeah. Compatibility is really important, As things change, new versions come out, you want to make sure that Azure understands how to use your template.
Absolutely. You don't want it breaking because, you used a feature from a different version or something.
Right. Exactly.
So moving on in the structure. Next, you have parameters. These are your input values that you're going to provide when you deploy your template. What's really cool here is how much control you have over defining those inputs. You can give each parameter a name, obviously, but you can also give it a default value that Azure will use if you don't provide one.
Yeah, that's handy.
Yeah, it is. You can define a list of allowed values. So you're kind of protecting yourself or protecting other users from, putting in incorrect or unsupported options.
No, it's a foolproof.
Yeah, exactly. And you can even set minimum, maximum length, numeric value restrictions, that kind of stuff. So it makes your templates really flexible, really reusable, because you can customize these deployments for different situations without having to change the core logic of the template itself.
To your point about flexibility, that's really where the infrastructure as code part comes in. You're essentially treating your infrastructure like software. You've got your code and you've got your inputs, and you can change the inputs without having to change the underlying code.
Exactly. Like imagine you're deploying the same application stack to different regions. Right. You could have a parameter for the region, and then the template just adapts, no problem.
Yeah.
Or if you're sizing virtual machines for different workloads, parameters make that super easy.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. A lot of people, when they're first starting out with A.R.M templates, they think, I've got to write everything from scratch all the time.
Right.
But with parameters, you can build these really reusable templates and just swap in and out different values.
Sure.
Saves a ton of time and effort.
Absolutely. And the third part of the structure is variables.
Okay.
This is where you define values that you're going to use repeatedly throughout your template. So it's kind of like setting a constant in programming, right?
Yep.
So you define this value once as a variable, and then you can just reference it over and over again in your resource definitions. Huge win for maintainability.
Yeah.
Because if you ever have to change that value, let's say you've got a common naming prefix you're using for all your resources, you update it in the variable section, and bam, that change goes everywhere it's used in the template. No more hunting and pecking, no more errors. It just makes updating so much easier.
Absolutely. Yeah, and consistency too. If you're using that same value in multiple places, it's going to be the same everywhere because it's coming from that variable. It's just good practice,
Yeah.
keep things clean, keep things organized, keep things maintainable.
Totally. Okay, so we've got our structure. Now let's move on to the real meat of these templates.
Yeah, the resources, the functions.
Exactly. Slide 3, resources and functions in A.R.M templates. So first up, resources.
Okay.
As the guide says, this is where you define the actual Azure services you want to deploy.
Right.
And each resource definition, it includes a type. So
Yeah.
that tells Azure what you're creating, like a virtual machine or a database server. And, there's a really crucial element called the API version. An API version, that's important because Azure services, they're always evolving, always changing, new features, new capabilities. And by putting the API version in your resource definition, you're telling Azure exactly which version of that service's configuration you want to use.
Yeah, and that's really important. You don't want to be using an old API version if there's a new one out there with all these great features.
Right, you want the latest and greatest usually.
Exactly. Yeah, but on the other hand, you also need to be aware that sometimes API versions get deprecated.
Yeah.
So it's good practice to go back and review your templates every once in a while. Make sure you're using the current recommended API version.
Yeah, good point. Don't want to be left behind.
Right.
And then the other key part of this slide is functions.
Right.
And the guide describes these as reusable procedures that you can call inside your template to do certain things. Like a common example, generating unique names for resources. Super important for a lot of Azure services.
Yeah.
But there are some limitations on what these template functions can do.
Yeah.
They can't directly access variables that are defined outside of the function itself. And they can only use parameters that you specifically pass into the function. And they can't use this reference function, which is used to get properties from already deployed resources.
And these limitations, they're there for a reason. They're there to make sure that the template is going to be evaluated in a predictable way.
Yeah, you want things to be reliable.
Right. You don't want any weird, unexpected behavior because the function is trying to do something it's not supposed to.
Exactly. So now we've defined our infrastructure. It's deployed. What happens next?
Well, what kind of information do we get back?
Yeah, that's slide 4, outputs and best practices. And first up, outputs. And this is how you define what information you want Azure to give back to you once the deployment's done, once it's successful. Like great examples in the guide, the public IP address of a new virtual machine.
Oh, yeah, that's a common one.
Or its fully qualified domain name. And a lot of times, these are values you won't know beforehand.
Right.
But they're crucial for connecting to that resource or configuring other things after it's deployed.
Yeah, outputs are great. I use them all the time. It's a clean, structured way to get that information, instead of digging through logs or having to manually look things up in the portal.
Totally. And then the guide talks about commenting your templates. And it might seem kind of obvious, but it's really, really important because those clear, concise comments, whether they're in line with like the double slash or in bigger blocks, they make your templates so much easier to understand.
Yeah, for yourself and for anyone else who might need to look at them.
Exactly. Now, one thing they do mention is that support for different comment styles can vary depending on the tools you're using. So, something to keep in mind.
It's always a good idea to double check. Especially if you're working in a team where people are using different editors or IDEs.
Absolutely. Consistency is key. And finally, the guide reiterates this idea of template maintenance. And really what they're getting at is if you build these templates well structured, if you're using variables, functions, and comments the right way, they're way easier to update and maintain.
Yeah, that's a big one. Your infrastructure is not going to stay static. It's going to change over time.
Yeah.
And you want your templates to be able to change with it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the guide's point is that, if you need to change a property of an Azure resource, you should only have to update it in one place, ideally, like in variable definition. You don't want to be going through the entire template and updating every instance of that value.
Yeah, you're just asking for trouble that way.
Exactly. It's about being efficient, being proactive.
And reducing errors.
Always.
Yeah.
Now, let's say you're new to this whole A.R.M template thing, or you need to deploy something common really quickly.
Yeah.
That's where slide 5, Azure Quick Start templates comes in.
Oh, yeah, I love these.
The guide introduces these, and they're this fantastic collection of ready-to-use A.R.M templates that the community has built and shared. Think of them as a library of blueprints for all sorts of deployments.
Right. Yeah.
Like from a simple virtual machine to a really complex multi-tier application. They're just a great resource, not just for learning how to structure these templates, but also for getting things up and running fast.
Yeah, it's a great way to learn by example. See how other people are doing it, see what works.
Exactly. Steal like an artist, right?
Exactly.
And one of the best things about them, these templates are hosted on GitHub.
Yeah, which is awesome.
It's awesome. You can see the source code. You can understand all the parameters. You can see how the deployment works. A lot of them have visualization tools too, so you get a visual overview of what resources will be deployed before you even hit the button.
And that's really helpful, especially if you're working with a complex template. You can kind of see what's going on, what's going to be created.
Absolutely. And speaking of hitting the button, they often have this deploy to Azure button right there on GitHub.
It's super easy.
Super easy. You click it, you fill in the parameters in the Azure portal, and you're off to the races.
Makes it really accessible. Even if you're not comfortable with the command line or anything like that, you can still use A.R.M Templates.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay, so you've used a template. Maybe you found a quick start template. You've deployed your resources.
Yep.
And those resources, they're probably in a resource group. So let's talk about managing those.
Resource group.
Resource group, slide 6. Azure Resource Group Management. The guide points out that when you're creating a new resource group, doesn't matter if you're using PowerShell or the Azure CLI, there are 2 parameters that you absolutely have to have.
Location and name.
Location and name. So location that specifies the region where you want to create the resource group, and that's where your resources will live. And the name, well, that's just the name you want to give it. The guide really emphasizes choosing a meaningful name, having a consistent naming convention.
Yeah, it's a key part of good management.
Yeah.
If you've got a whole bunch of resource groups and they're all named randomly, it's going to be a nightmare to try to figure out what's what.
Totally. And then the slide moves on to Cloud Shell features. Now, for those that don't know, Cloud Shell is this awesome browser-based shell environment. You can get to it right in the Azure portal.
Oh, yeah, it's really convenient.
It's awesome. And they highlight some of the key advantages. Automatic authentication. So you don't have to log in every time. It just knows who you are.
Yep. Saves a lot of time.
It does. You've got access to both Bash and PowerShell, so you can use whatever you're comfortable with.
Right.
It's got a built-in editor, so you can create and modify files right there in the browser. And, they do mention that Cloud Shell needs an Azure file share so you can save your data. And every user gets their own dedicated machine in the Cloud Shell environment.
Yeah, so your stuff's not getting mixed up with anyone else's. It's a really nice, clean environment.
It is. And then they contrast Cloud Shell with local PowerShell management.
Right.
So if you're using PowerShell on your own computer, you got to connect to your Azure account explicitly using the connect as account command. And that's because your local PowerShell, it's not automatically logged in like Cloud Shell is.
Right. Makes sense.
So now let's say you want to reorganize your Azure environment after you've already deployed some things.
Okay.
Slide 7. Resource movement and limitations is all about this. And they start by being really upfront. Entire Azure tenants, those can't be moved between subscriptions.
Yeah, that's a hard limit. It's just too complex.
It is. But the good news is lots of individual resource types, they can be moved between resource groups, between subscriptions even. They give us some examples: key vaults, storage accounts, virtual machines. But there are some things to consider when you're moving stuff.
Right.
You got to think about those dependencies. Like if you move a database, you got to move the applications that use it. You got to make sure the resource types are available in the target region. You got to make sure your subscription has enough quota.
Yeah, planning is key. You don't want to just start moving stuff around willy-nilly. You got to think about the consequences.
Exactly. Think before you act. Now let's get a little deeper into the structure of these templates.
Okay.
Slide 8. Template schema and format. So we've talked about how A.R.M templates use JSON format. And JSON, that's a text-based data format, uses key value pairs. And this structured format, it's how Azure reads and understands your template.
Yeah, JSON's pretty easy to read. It's easy for humans to understand, but it's also easy for machines to parse. It's a good choice for something like this.
And they list those key elements in the schema: functions, outputs, parameters.
Yeah.
But they specifically say inputs. Those are not part of the schema itself.
Yeah, because those are external. Those are the things you provide when you deploy the template.
Exactly. And then the slide really hits on schema versioning.
Right.
And it might seem like a small thing, but that schema reference at the beginning of your template, that's super important. It tells Azure which version of the template language you're using. And if you're using features from a newer version, you got to make sure that schema reference is updated. Otherwise, Azure might not be able to understand it.
Yeah, it's like setting the ground rules. You're telling Azure, hey, this is the version I'm using, so interpret my template accordingly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So last but not least, slide 9, managing resource limits and quotas. This is just practical stuff when you're working with any cloud platform, really. The guide gives the example of a default limit of 50 virtual machines per region in a subscription.
Yeah.
And, these limits are there for a reason. They prevent accidental over-provisioning. They make sure that resources are allocated fairly.
They protect the platform,
Right.
and they protect you from accidentally spending a lot of money.
Exactly.
Right.
But they also make the point, these limits, they can be increased. So you hit that limit of 50 VMs. You can contact Microsoft support. They can bump you up, in this case, to 500. And you usually just need a single support ticket.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. And that's the recommended approach.
It is. They really emphasize, when you hit these limits, don't try to get all hacky and work around them.
Right.
Just request a quota increase. It's the clean, supported way to do it.
And it's really not that complicated. There's usually a link right in the portal, request increase, you click it, you fill out a form, and they take care of it.
Exactly. So to sum up, what have we learned about A.R.M templates? We've gone through a lot. We've seen they're more than just JSON files. They're blueprints.
Yes.
Powerful blueprints for defining and deploying your infrastructure as code. They give you that consistency, that repeatability, that control. We've seen how they're structured with the schema, the parameters, the variables.
Yeah.
We've looked at how you define your resources, how you use functions for automation. We've talked about those outputs, best practices for comment, those Azure Quick Start templates, which are a great resource.
Oh, yeah, definitely check those out.
And then those management aspects.
Yeah.
Resource groups, moving resources, the JSON format and schema versioning, and those resource limits and quotas.
Lots of good stuff.
Lots of good stuff.
I think if you understand these core concepts, you're well on your way to mastering infrastructure as code in Azure.
Absolutely.
A.R.M templates are just such a powerful tool.
They are, and they're only going to become more important.
Yeah.
So here's a final thought, and I really want you to think about this. Think about how this idea of infrastructure as code with A.R.M templates, how it could totally change how you work with cloud resources.
Yeah.
What kind of efficiency could you unlock? What kind of agility? What new possibilities could open up?
Yeah, those are good questions to ask yourself. It can really be a game changer.
It can. So if you're ready to dive in, I highly recommend checking out those Azure Quick Start templates on GitHub. It's a great way to see how it's done, to learn by example, and maybe even deploy your first template.
Yeah, jump in, get your hands dirty, you'll learn a lot.
Absolutely. So thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.